China, as we are told, inveigles poorer countries into taking out loan after loan to build expensive infrastructure that they can't afford and that will yield few benefits, all with the end goal of Beijing eventually taking control of these assets from its struggling borrowers. The Chinese debt trap is a myth. The narrative wrongfully portrays both Beijing and the developing countries it deals with. In today's video, we'll be analyzing China's debt trap in Africa. For starters, how does China's lending compare with others? China does not publish records of its foreign loans, and the majority of its contracts contain non-disclosure clauses that prevent borrowers from revealing their contents. It argues that such confidentiality is common practice for international loan contracts. Confidentiality agreements are very common in international commercial loans, says Professor Lee Jones at the Queen Mary University of London. Much of China's development financing is fundamentally a commercial operation. Most of the major industrialized nations share information about their lending activities through membership in what's known as the Paris Club. Statistics of debts owed by Africa. In June 2022, according to a report by researchers from Columbia University and the University of Oxford, the debt trap narrative is a function of China-US strategic and ideological rivalry rather than a reflection of African realities or perspectives. While China is Africa's biggest bilateral creditor, most of the African debt is held by private Western holders, specifically American and European investors. At the end of 2019, Africa's total debt was equal to $964 billion, and the total debt owed to Chinese entities was equal to $78 billion, which is equal to about 8% of the region's total debt. African countries rapidly increased their borrowing from China between 2000 and 2014, totaling $94.5 billion, as they sought to end their dependence on the IMF and World Bank, which demand liberalization in exchange for loans. Chinese loans are more expensive but secured by high-revenue projects. China is a major project stakeholder in the economies of many African countries, significantly influencing the continent's affairs. According to 2015 and 2017 World Bank records, several African countries owe large debts to China and other creditor nations. Private sector interest rates of about 55% prompted some African countries to go to China, which charges about 17% for loans. Debts from African countries to China paid for the investment in sectors needing critical development. Case studies of Chinese lending to Africa. 1. Angola. China's debt exposure to Angola has accumulated dramatically over the last 20 years. After the civil war ended in 2002, reconstruction was the Angolan government's top priority. China provided significant assistance by kickstarting over 100 projects in energy, water, health, education, telecommunications, fisheries, and public works, backed mostly by oil loans. In 2021, Angola was the most indebted country to China of any African state. In the same year, 72% of all Angola's oil exports went to China, making Angola the fifth largest exporter of oil to China. Meanwhile, China holds around 40% of outstanding government external debt, worth about $18 billion. China has made over $42 billion in loan commitments to Angola over the last 20 years. The IMF has estimated that the Angolan government debt-to-GDP ratio stood at 86.4% in 2021 and will stand at 56.6% in 2022, having decreased from over 130% in 2020 due to currency and oil price fluctuations. The Angolan government projected that debt servicing costs will stand at $12.9 billion in 2022, of which 38% relates to external debt. As of December 2021, $13.6 billion of Angola's recognized debt to China was owed to the China Development Bank, with $4 billion owed to the Export-Import Bank of China, Exim Bank. It has also borrowed from China's largest commercial lender, the Industrial and Commercial Bank of China. China holds around 40% of outstanding external Angolan government debt, negotiated with Angola for a 3-year moratorium on principal repayments, CDB and ICBC, and supported Angola's call for G20 action on relieving debt distress during the COVID-19 pandemic via the DSSI. 2. Zambia. Accusations by local civil society organizations of China seeking to accrue political influence by deliberately building Zambia's debt are exaggerated but should not be disregarded. The history of Sino-Zambian relations dates to China's support for Zambian independence, which was achieved in 1964. Recent interest in Zambia has been primarily driven by efforts to obtain access to resources, including copper, gold, and manganese. The Zambian government's relationship with China has become a domestic political issue of growing importance. Public resentment towards China is in part due to poor working conditions and perceptions of prioritizing the needs of Chinese expatriates over locals. However, it is predominantly a result of the lack of clarity about China's role and intentions in Zambia, and the terms of the many deals China has struck there over the last decade. In Africa, Zambia hosts the second largest number, after Angola, of Chinese construction firms that have contracts to work on and operate Chinese loan finance projects. Moreover, Zambia has agreed to lines of credit with at least 18 distinct Chinese lenders. A large number of stakeholders means that there is little or no top-down coordination or strategic oversight of these debts. Zambia's total public debt to foreign and domestic lenders was just shy of $34 billion at the end of 2021, around 133% of GDP. According to the IMF, of these, $16.8 billion were in foreign holdings. China accounts for about one-third of the foreign debt, but Zambia has also borrowed heavily from others, including the IFIs and the commercial Eurobond market. This has been driven by considerable infrastructure development spending, which is politically popular but requires substantial financing. In 2020, Zambia became the first country in Africa during the COVID-19 pandemic to default on a debt when it failed to pay a coupon on its Eurobond. The government's request for a 6-month extension in interest payments was rejected by bondholders, who reportedly cited the opacity and preferential payback terms of the country's debt to China as a reason for not approving the extension. In December 2021, the IMF and Zambia reached a staff-level agreement on an adjustment program, but securing the next step, debt restructuring assurances from Zambia's official creditors, proved difficult once again because of the need for transparency around Chinese loans. The Zambian government demonstrated significant leadership in bringing partners into a single official committee to restructure the debts, rather than negotiating bilaterally, as was the preference of China. 3. Djibouti. Located in the Horn of Africa, Djibouti is situated on the Strait of Bab el-Mandeb, a 19-kilometer-wide choke point that sees roughly 30% of global shipping pass through on its way to the Red Sea and the Suez Canal. Djibouti's strategic location and deep-water port complex attracted China to establish its first-ever overseas military base there in 2017, just 6 miles from an equivalent U.S. military installation. China has markedly increased its focus on Djibouti in the past 2 decades due to its critical geostrategic location and its status as the transshipment point for 95% of neighboring Ethiopia's import and export trade. Despite challenges due to the ongoing war in Ethiopia, Djibouti has a significant shortfall in critical infrastructure, which traditional donors have proved reluctant to finance. This challenge persuaded Djibouti's leaders to turn increasingly towards China for assistance. In total, China provided $1.4 billion of investments and loans for infrastructure in Djibouti between 2012 and 2020. Djibouti's relations with China have deepened further in recent years. In late January 2016, the president of Djibouti, Ismail Omar Guelleh, signed 3 agreements with China, following an announcement by Beijing that it would open a military logistics facility in Djibouti. These arrangements included a legal framework for Chinese banks to operate in Djibouti, presaging a steady flow of credit and the creation of a 48-square-kilometer free trade zone. According to the IMF, Djibouti's public external debt rose from 50% of GDP in 2016 to over 70% by 2020. Over half of the debt burden is Chinese lending, with the total debt obligation to Beijing standing at $1.2 billion, representing over 45% of Djibouti's GDP. The amount is double Djibouti's debt to multilateral creditors, which totals $600 million. From a Chinese perspective, Djibouti offers a clear illustration of the tension between lending to certain African countries that are likely to struggle to make repayments in the future and the geostrategic imperative of building and maintaining influence. Measures to mitigate the impact of the war in Ukraine and the worsening drought have put pressure on the fiscal deficit. Public debt service has more than tripled in 2022, leading the government to temporarily suspend some of its foreign debt payments to 2 creditors, China and Kuwait. On top of these shocks, The expiration of the DSSI at the end of 2021 has affected Djibouti, with the potential DSSI savings in 2021 amounting to $143.5 million, according to the World Bank. Therefore, it is unsurprising that Djibouti is having repayment troubles. Taken together, a volatile region and uncertain internal politics mean that Djibouti cannot assume that its geopolitical importance to China will continue to protect it indefinitely from facing the consequences of a mounting debt burden. 4. Kenya. Between 2006 and 2017, Kenya borrowed at least $9.8 billion from China. Chinese debt accounts for 21% of Kenya's foreign debt and 72% of the country's bilateral debt. China lent Kenya funds to build highways and a railway between Mombasa and Nairobi, totaling over $6.5 billion by 2020. Kenya reportedly came close to defaulting on Chinese loans to develop its largest and most lucrative port, the Port of Mombasa. In late December 2018, there was speculation that a default could have forced Kenya to relinquish control of the port to China. However, reports have cast doubt on the Chinese debt trap threat to the port. Kenyan media have debated whether Chinese loans are worth the risk, saying that these loans could jeopardize Kenyan sovereignty. There are several other countries involved in China's debt trap, including South Africa, Ivory Coast, as the list goes on and on. Infrastructure constructed by Chinese companies has mostly been financed by loans. In its borrowing, therefore, the use of Chinese loans to finance roads, ports, dams, and bridges has been an extension of a tried and tested approach. The resulting infrastructure is likely to prove vital in supporting continued economic growth. Again, China's Foreign Minister Qin Gang rejected accusations that the money his nation lends to Africa is a debt trap on his first official trip since he was appointed last month. China's investment and financing assistance to Africa is not a trap, it is a benefit, Qin told a Semaphore News event in Washington. He added that African countries should be places for international cooperation, including between China and the United States, for the benefit of Africans, not geopolitical games. In your opinion, what could be China's ulterior motive in giving out debts to African countries? Leave your thoughts in the comment section below, and also subscribe to our channel for more interesting and educative updates about Africa. See you in our next video.